Hi, my name's Penny, and as usual, I'm here to talk about some bookish things. Specifically, today I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about the last 1,000 pages of YA fantasy that I've read. Actually, I think I've got about 2,000 pages here, but I just read so much fantasy that it's been collecting up. I'm a little bit behind on these 1,000 pages videos where I group 1,000 pages of a particular genre together and then talk about them in a little bit more depth than I have time to in my wrap-ups. However, although it is 2,000-ish pages, it is only 4 books. So as usual, I'm going to talk about them from worst to best and try to tell you what it's about, what I liked and what I didn't like, and who I think might like this book. I am, however, having a bit of a debate with myself about which is the worst of these 4 books, because the lowest 2 are both series, and yet I'm thinking of continuing the one I think is the worst and not continuing the second worst. And does that even make sense? Why am I making my decisions like this? Anyway, let's just talk about them in the order and question my decisions later. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Eldest by Christopher Paolini. This is the second book in the Inheritance cycle, which is this series all about dragons. Specifically, this young boy finds a dragon egg and becomes the first dragon rider in a really long time. It's set in a world where there are dwarves and elves and all those classic fantasy creatures, as well as an evil king that he's obviously working up towards taking down. I listened to this on audiobook, which thank goodness, because apparently it's a 700-page book. That is really long. And if I had to tell you what exactly happened in this book, I mean, I probably couldn't because it's spoilers for the first book, but does 700 pages worth of stuff happen? No, I don't think so. Mostly he is spending this book training with the elves and learning some stuff. I did think that there were some good twists in this story, but when the twists weren't happening, I found it quite hard to feel engaged. And I also felt like it jumped into things very quickly, didn't really give me much of a recap of what was going on. There's a lot of characters to keep track of, which would probably be fine if you were engaged, but because I'm not, I keep forgetting who different people are. Also, Christopher Paolini was very young when he wrote this series, so my hope is that this is going to continue to improve as the series goes on. I don't think the second book proved that that's what's going to happen, but I'm still hopeful, and I guess that's why I'm thinking of continuing this series and not continuing the next series that I'm going to talk about, because I just have much more hope for this series. It could be that in the end I'm going to be disappointed, and I think when I finish the 4th book in the series, I think there's 4 books, when I finish that, I will let you know how I found the series as a whole. I really want to like this series because I do really like dragons, and I don't think the concept of the dragons or the way the dragons are written in this book is bad. I quite like the dragons. I think the main problem I have with this series is that I don't really care for the main character, Eragon, because Eragon is just typical, boring, whiny guy. As far as who I would recommend this series to, I think I'm going to hold off on that until I finish this series. But so far, my general thoughts are, if you are new to fantasy and you really love dragons, then you might still get some enjoyment out of this. So the next best series that I read was Blood Witch by Susan Dennard. So this is the 3rd book in the Truth Witch series, or I think it's actually called The Witchlands. And it's a story initially about these 2 witches that are best friends. One of them is a thread witch who has the ability to see the different threads between different people, and the other is a truth witch who's able to see whether people are telling the truth or lying. And in this world there's also a bunch of other people with witch powers, so different elemental powers. There's sight witches who can see the future, word witches who can communicate over long distances, just all sorts of different witch powers, which I do really like the different witch powers. And there's a lot of world building in this series, so the world is very rich and complex, but at the same time I just don't feel like the characters are very realistic. In this 3rd book, obviously we're following a blood witch who has the ability to manipulate and detect people's blood. He can also heal himself super fast. And what is he even doing in this book? I don't know. It seemed like it was quite a long book. It was quite a long book, like 500 and something pages. And personally, I felt, again, like not much happened during that time. There is a lot of drama that's been set up in some of the previous books, and so they're dealing with that, but it follows quite a few different characters, and each one of those characters really didn't make much progress at all within this book. I think in the end, the thing that's pushing me to stop reading this series is that I found each successive book more and more boring, and initially I was willing to push through because I thought it was just going to be a trilogy. However, now I believe it's going to be at least a 5-book series, if not longer, and I don't think I'm willing to read it if it goes on that long. Mainly I think because the writing style is just not something that I enjoy, and I know there are plenty of other people who love this series, so obviously that writing style is something that some people enjoy. It's just not for me. Additionally, I did listen to the audiobook for this, and it was weird because we have this American narrator, and yet all the characters are being voiced as European or Indian or Russian and Middle Eastern, all those kind of accents. So it seemed really weird that the narrator was American. The story is told in third person, but it's usually told from a particular person's perspective, so you're able to see their thoughts, and it would be very off-putting when you're hearing somebody's thoughts and then suddenly they're speaking in a completely different accent from what they were thinking. And I kept waiting for one of the characters to actually have this American accent, but none of them did. And so I don't really understand why the narrator wasn't one of the main accents being used by the characters. I think that put me off quite a lot. So I was hoping that I could continue this series by using the audiobooks to make it a little bit easier to get through, but I just don't think it's going to happen. So as I said, some people do really love this series, so it's obviously for some people. I think you're probably best to try and sample the first chapter and see whether you think the writing is something you can put up with for 5 or possibly more books. I would also say that people that like this series seem to also like the Falling Kingdoms series, which I also hated. So possibly, if you like Falling Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes, you might like the Witchlands series. So the next book we have to talk about is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. So I read this as part of the Book Junkie Trials. A lot of people will have read it for that recently because it was the group book. And I do know that a lot of people were quite disappointed in this, and I think a large part of that was because they watched the movie first, and I have to admit that the movie is a lot better than the book. Personally, I read the book first. I did watch the trailer before I read the book, and I think that helped me to have the characters pictured in my head a little bit. And I think also it made me anticipate that some cool things were going to happen, so it helped me to get through some of the slower bits of the story. So what is Stardust about? Stardust starts in this small little village which has a wall next to it over which there is this fairyland type place. And every 9 years in this fairyland, next to the wall, there is a market, and the people from kind of the regular world can go over there and get some magical things. But the rest of the time, you're not allowed to go over the wall. In this story, we follow this young guy named Tristan. He is infatuated with this girl that he barely knows. He ends up promising that he's going to go and catch this fallen star for her, and the expectation is that once he does that, she'll marry him. I know that this premise puts people off a little bit because in the beginning, especially, Tristan is kind of a bit of a dick. Like the idea of falling in love with someone when you barely know them and being so over the top is kind of annoying, but that said, it's very realistic for young people of any gender to act in this way, or even sometimes some of us older people make these kind of mistakes. And also the idea of the book is that Tristan learns throughout the story what real relationships are like. So it is written in a very fairy tale style. If you've read a lot of Neil Gaiman stuff, I think it's pretty similar. Can be a little bit self-indulgent when he goes on about bits that aren't necessarily relevant to the story. But I think in this book he actually did that less than he does in some of his other books. I did especially love the Lords of Stormhold, especially the dead ones. I thought they played a really interesting part in the story, and in the end everything was wrapped up really nicely. I do think that one thing that the movie didn't do as well is the way that everything linked in together, especially there is this one woman who is enslaved by this witch, and there are very specific criteria that need to happen in order for her to be freed, and I really liked how that was done so organically. And I think the movie changed a few things, so that wasn't quite as clear or as good in the movie. But that said, the book really doesn't have much depth to it. It's 267 pages, so it's pretty quick. It's very surface level, kind of a classic good versus evil battle, and the movie definitely did a much better job of developing the characters and keeping the action going throughout. I think the movie just did a much better job of making the characters cool and interesting, and the movie had some really good actors in it as well. So there was Al Pacino and Michelle Pfeiffer and Claire Danes, and they're all really good actors, so that helped the movie a lot as well, I think. I do think if you like fairy tale, whimsical stories, and you don't mind that the main character is sometimes an annoying, whiny guy, then you might really enjoy this book. Also, I think if you haven't seen the movie, you might be more likely to like the book because you won't have such high expectations for the book. So lastly, I'm going to talk about The Last Magicians by Lisa Maxwell. This is the first book in a series, and I only gave it 3 stars, although I do wonder if I might have liked it more if I'd gone in with lower expectations or just more realistic expectations, because I went in thinking this was going to be an adult fantasy and that it was going to be quite dark, but actually it's a YA fantasy and there is quite a heavy romance element, and it definitely wasn't as dark as I was expecting. I think maybe for a YA fantasy it is a bit dark, maybe, but it's definitely not as dark as some of the stuff I like. I quite like it when things get quite dark and twisty, and this definitely wasn't at that level, but it was still okay. So we follow this young girl, I forget her name, but she is a magician and she has the ability to move herself through time and space. So in our current time, the magicians are all trapped on this particular island, and so this young girl gets sent back in time in order to track down certain artifacts that they think will be able to help them free themselves. So she goes back to this particular time where a certain artifact was lost because another magician betrayed this other group of magicians. This is getting complicated, but she's basically trying to work out who was the betrayer and get herself in there so that she can steal the item instead. So there are a lot of different magicians in this story and they all have different powers. I do think sometimes it was a little bit difficult to figure out what different people's powers were for a little while, and I couldn't really tell whether that was intentional or not. Also, as I said, quite heavy on the romance, which isn't something I particularly enjoy. At the end, the bad guy did give this massive monologue explaining exactly what he was doing and why, and it really didn't seem very realistic, and it was also kind of boring. So that was a bit disappointing. But as I said, it was okay. I especially liked it once we got near the end. The romance kind of was put on hold for a little bit, or at least the amount of romance in there fit with the story, but the pace really picked up. Things started to get a little bit tricksy, which is what I want from stories that involve time travel. And I really loved how they wove together the different timelines and made everything make sense. I am going to continue this series because I think the way things have been set up are going to really enable it to do some cool stuff in the future. I really hope that it does. I do think that if you like YA fantasy and you don't mind when there's quite a bit of romance, perhaps if you like heist books, any of those things, I think you might really enjoy this book. I would also recommend the audiobook because I listened to it on audiobook and I quite enjoyed it. I know I said some negative things so it doesn't sound like I enjoyed it, but I did actually enjoy it. I just had these expectations going in that kind of disrupted the reading experience for me. So those are the last 1,000-ish pages of YA fantasy that I read. Do let me know if you've read any of these books. I would love to know what you thought about them, or otherwise whether you're interested in picking up any of these. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.